Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming today. So welcome to UC Center Sacramento. We have a great talk today by Professor Mindy Romero from UC Davis. And the Honorable Delane Easton will be introducing Professor Romero. But before she does, let me go ahead and share a few words about the Honorable Miss Easton. So she is a double UC graduate. She received her undergraduate degree from UC Davis and her master's degree in political science from UC Santa Barbara. She taught at several community colleges before going into public service, and she served on our local city council, the state assembly, and as state superintendent of public instruction. She is a champion of education, both at the K through 12 and higher education, and a good friend of UCCS, having served as our governance fellow in 2014. It gives me great pleasure to ask Ms. Easton to come up and introduce today's speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cindy. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I suppose we should have asked for seat belts since we've just gone through the 2016 election. And so I'm especially thrilled today to welcome our marvelous speaker, Director Mindy Romero. She directs the California Civic Education Project Center for Regional Change at the University of California, Davis, and she is the founder of that organization. So she's got a wonderful, wonderful history. Her undergraduate degrees are in political science and sociology from UC Davis. She got her master's in sociology from UC Davis and her PhD in sociology from UC Davis. Her interests are very diverse. She's interested not only in political sociology, but collective political behavior, youth civic engagement, which is near and dear to my heart, and social stratification, social psychology, and race and ethnicity. I took the first ever race relations class offered at UC Davis. It was taught by a white man who, we had one African-American student, and well, it was an African student in the class, only one, and he was from Africa. So although we are struggling right now, we are far more diverse at our wonderful UC and in our wonderful state, and we need to understand what just happened here and see how it fits into the context of the marvelous, marvelous country in which we live. Her research reports and publications are way too numerous to mention, but we are here today to see how did Californians vote in the 2016 general election. Dr. Romero, thank you for joining us.
Hello. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Is everyone doing well, I hope? Eating? Food is good, right? Okay. So it's a good turnout, especially for a day that most folks aren't used to coming here. We're not on a Thursday, the Thursday lunch series. So thank you very much for checking your invitation and knowing it was a Tuesday, not a Thursday. That's always big. So I'm going to talk to you, I'm going to throw a lot of numbers at you today because I'm going to break down the 2016 vote. So probably many of you, I know this is always a savvy crowd here, you've heard some initial numbers, official numbers from the Secretary of State in terms of what the turnout was in California for the general population, and I'll cover those as well. But it always takes a little while to be able to get data by subgroup. And depending on your data source, it can actually, if you're looking to use the current population survey data from the census, that takes actually several more months. So we're just now getting these data in and doing the first kind of public analysis of the vote. Did anyone go to my talk on Friday at the Capitol? Anybody here? One overlap. Oh, just one person. Okay, good. There'll be similar talks, but this time around it'll be much more exciting because I will remember my data more, something like that. I think I'm trying to sell you on staying. Okay, so how did Californians vote in the 2016 election? Well, we're going to talk about that breakdown, as I mentioned. But we're also going to ask the question, did California's electorate become more representative? Now, when I talk about representation, I'm talking numeric representation. So, as many of you probably know, California's electorate, voting electorate, pie of all actual voters, doesn't look like, it's not representative of the state of California by a number of measures, by race, ethnicity, age, income, educational status. It's essentially older, whiter, more wealthier, and more educated. And again, you can look at a number of measures, right? It's not representative. There's lots of reasons for that, and we'll talk about why that, how that looks in 2016, and did we become more representative? And then, of course, where do we go from here? But just briefly, and I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A, just a little bit on our data. So when I talk about historical numbers, you'll have a lot of charts that'll kind of put 2016 in context. I'm pulling data from the statewide database. 2016 numbers, data from Political Data Incorporated. Wonderful source of data there. And population data, current population survey from the census and the California Department of Finance. And those data stand on their own. I'll have some slides that just talk about population, and then also when we calculate eligible voter turnout, we need population data to do that. Okay. So what happened? So I'm actually going to talk a little bit about the U.S. context first. So how do we compare to what we saw in the U.S. as a whole? So the final numbers have settled out at about 60% eligible voter turnout. And when I say eligible, you'll hear me use two measures of voter turnout. One is registered, which probably most people know. That's the turnout, the percentage of those who are registered to vote that actually voted, registered voter turnout. Eligible voter turnout, as we define it, is the percentage of those who were eligible, so adult citizens, right, who voted, who actually voted, whether they're registered or not. Just of that population eligible to vote, what percentage actually voted, right? Okay. And in the U.S., now we don't have current population survey data, as I mentioned, but we do have a wonderful project called the U.S. Elections Project by colleague Mike McDonald out of University of Florida, some of you know, that collects actual voter records from around the country and has done this for quite some time now, and gives us, which many scholars and many journalists go to as a key source, gives us that early look at what turnout was. And so 60%. Where does that put us? That puts us as higher than 2012, not as high as 2008. It was about 62% when you're comparing same data, apples to apples, and higher than 2000. So I would say a good year, but not a record-breaking year, right? Now you can argue whether 60% is good enough, right? But in terms of that context. So something else I'll just briefly tackle. This election, I think, was a surprise for just about everybody, right? No matter where you fall on the political spectrum, no matter who you voted for. And many people coming out of the election said, whether they were happy about it or not happy about it, you'd hear some sort of phrasing of, I can't believe a majority of America voted for, or I can't believe a majority of America now has made these choices. And really, we all know about the Electoral College, but if we just look at the total vote, we've got about, of course, almost 66 million. Clinton won the popular vote by nearly 3 million. What made the difference was about 77,000 votes in 3 states. But beyond that, I want to emphasize here in terms of just the people that are participating in this decision, whatever election it is. It doesn't have to be about Trump or Clinton. In whatever election, whatever presidential election we're talking about, it's pretty darn consistent, right, that we're going to have a huge chunk of eligible voters in this country not picking the president. And in this case, nearly about 100 million, 90-something, were eligible and didn't vote. And it means that about a quarter of eligible voters actually selected the president in this election, right? And that's pretty common, up or down by a few percentage points. So just a point to make there. So what about California? So I think it really comes down to, I could have labeled this slide Great Expectations. It comes down to your expectations. So going into the election, there was a lot of talk, a lot of excitement, a lot of speculation about what turnout might be, at least in many circles, right? Some of that from advocates and organizers that were working really hard to get out the vote in general or certain segments of the vote, a lot of work around the Latino vote in California, a lot of work around the youth vote, right? Many of you heard this. Some of you were a part of this. And coming out of the election, how you view the numbers I'm going to show you. Now, I think they're exciting, but I'm a researcher, right? Anxiously awaiting as I'm making my calculations. But some of you will think, hey, pretty good or pretty exciting. Depending on your expectations, maybe not good enough, right? Or maybe even disappointing. So I think this often is the case, but I think particularly in this election. And given also for many people, the stakes are really high, right, on all sides. And of course, California, we're not just talking about presidential race. We're talking about an open Senate seat. We're talking about other state races and local races that many people had a stake in or felt that very strongly about and were working towards. Okay, so just rate expectations, or what were your expectations? So, oh, and then since I showed you the national numbers, if you didn't hear, Clinton, right, got about 62% of the vote, statewide, 32% for Trump. And just this map here from the Secretary of State's office just emphasizes, we say we're a blue state. We're not a solidly blue state. We're shades of blue and communities of red, right? And we have, not Orange County did go blue. Fresno went blue, just barely, but went blue. But we have many communities, right, that, at least in terms of a majority, voted Republican. And again, not even counting the other races. Okay. Now, before I can talk about the vote, talking about great expectations, a big part of the expectation consideration or story was also registration numbers. There was a lot of news media, a lot of news pieces, articles. I know I got interviewed by a lot of folks hearing these reports coming out of the Secretary of State's office and other places saying, oh my gosh, we're seeing these, at times and in the end, record-breaking numbers for registration. Pretty exciting, right? And we did have that. That also might, I think very much actually, lent itself to speculation about what this would mean. Would these voters turn out? Or excuse me, would these registered voters turn out? Or would the context that they were registered in somehow influence them in a different way than we would expect, right? So about 2 million. So really, when we talk about the surge, first off, we're generally saying since the January 1st of 2016. That doesn't mean that clearly January, February was not as high as when you're getting closer to the election. But we started to see some numbers. We always see a surge in registration before an election. That's pretty normal. This was much bigger and started much earlier. Make sense? So as I'm tracking numbers and other folks are tracking numbers, we start seeing in about January, oh, there's a nice little bump there, right? Earlier and bigger than we would expect. That's the simplest way that I can put it. So from January, and we did start at a lower point in terms of registration in January. For lots of different reasons, the state had updated some of its registration rolls. It was at 70% for a registration rate. Registration rate is the percentage of those who are eligible to register who are registered. So we were already starting with a lower number, but we were at about 17.2 million. From January through just about the close of registration, we added a little over 2 million people to the registration rolls. We actually had many more than that register. They registered new, they re-registered for lots of different reasons, address changes, things like that. We saw a lot of people coming through, a lot of people using the online platform particularly, and I'll leave that there. But in the end, the net, we had about 2 million, a little over 2 million added, okay? And we ended up with a record 19.4 million. We're a little bit above that now, 19.4 million. So in terms of a registration rate, though, that's what you really have to look at. So this is exciting, but we have an increasing population every year, so we would expect an increase in terms of the total number. So in terms of registration rate, and I will show that to you. Yeah, there we go. Just go ahead and move on over. We're right now at about 79% registration. That itself is not, that's very high, but that's not a record. About 20 or so years ago, we saw something about 80% registration rate. And normally we hover around 75%, give or take a percent or two, on presidential years. And generally, registration rates don't change a whole lot. They fluctuate by a few percentage points. Turnout statewide fluctuates significantly depending on the type of election, whether it's midterm or presidential, whether it's primary or general, right? The registration rates stay relatively steady. So we did see a good bump at a 79% registration rate, but not a record. Oopsie. And then we also saw, because the question is, did everybody, this big surge, what did it mean? I got that question over and over again. Yes, everyone benefited from the surge by group, and I'll just show you a few groups here. But did we close the gap? So first, let's talk about the gap. So I think I have a laser pointer. usually don't like laser pointers, but 79.4% for everybody that's registered, eligible. This is the percent that's registered. Latino, 68%. Asian American, 59%. Youth, 62%. And then with these data, which are actual voter records, we can't identify whites or separate out whites and African Americans. So the best way we can do that for Latino and Asian American, is if we just look at everybody who isn't Latino and Asian American, which in our state, about 86, 87% of that population is white. We have a smaller African American population in California than we have in the U.S. as a whole. So this is mostly white, and so that registration rate is not 79, it's almost 89%, right? So look at this, from 89% then to Latino, 68%, 20 percentage points difference, 30 percentage points difference when we're talking about Asian American, right? So disparities remain. One thing, and I'm going to show you something historical to put it in context, but let me show you youth here. This was pretty exciting, though, for me to see this, because young people did help close the gap in their registration. So normally, typically, registration for those age 18 to 24, their rates are about 50, 51, 52, 53, maybe 54, right next to, backing up to an election period. But to jump up to 63% is quite significant. So they closed the gap, no doubt about that. And we were expecting to see something like that, didn't know exactly what it would be, but when we look at that surge of registration, young people were overrepresented in that surge of registration, okay? Now let's go back a little bit. So I've got a lot of numbers here, so I'm gonna walk you through it. On 2016, these are the numbers I just gave you. See, 79% for everybody, that's the blue, if you can see in the back. 88% for non-Asian, non-Latino, 59% for Asian American, right, and 68% for Latino, right, same numbers. So, and we just go back here just a few elections for comparable data, but what's one story, without looking at the numbers, you see disparities, period, right, going back. So this is jagged. Anything that seems a little different with 2016 versus the other years? They're a little closer together, right? This is the easiest way I can tell the story without getting into like statistical analysis. And, it's less jaggedy. That's a technical term. But you can see that. So disparities remain, and they are quite significant, but got a little bit better, comparatively speaking, in 2016 with registration rates. But they remain, and they're quite significant. Okay, let's talk about turnout. Now, I've set the stage. Great expectations, registration surge, right? So 14.6 million votes, and you probably heard about 58.7% official eligible voter turnout numbers from the Secretary of State, 75 for registered voter turnout. Depending on the measure, we'll tell you how we did, right? We're somewhere in between 2008 and 2012. So using eligible voter turnout, that's the second highest in 30 years in terms of eligible voter turnout. So it was a very strong, good year. Not a record, but a very strong, good year. Registered is about in between 2008 and 2012, and part of that is because we also had a bigger denominator with all those new registrants. I'll leave it there. But let me briefly, and I'm going to come back to this chart a little later, but let me just show you disparities across counties, though, right? So this is total eligible voter turnout. We know for the state it was 58.7%. And looking across counties, this is this little legend here. The lightest shade, which nothing is represented right now in this one, is under 30% eligible voter turnout, then 30 to 40, 40 to 50, 50 to 60. The darkest shade is 60 plus. We see that counties that did better than the state average are along the coast, right? Some in the Sierras. Where do you see the lightest shade on this map? Central Valley, right? Now remember the shading here. We're going to come back to this when we look at Latinos and Asian Americans. Okay, but not yet. So while we're still talking about total, I just want to show you, I put the top two counties, Marin, often the case. So there's 79.8% for eligible voter turnout. And they gained about 5 percentage points, not 5%, but 5 percentage points over 2012. And they're first, and they're often first. Sierra, 75, second, right? That's their change, plus over 2012. With me so far? Okay. And then I put some major cities that might be of interest to you. I don't have San Diego, no offense to San Diego. But every time I do that, somebody asks me. So San Francisco, 67.7. We always hear about the San Francisco Bay Area having such strong turnout. They do, but I wanted to show you. Ranked at 8th, right? Pretty significant gain over 2012. LA, 58%, just below the state average. Ranked, pretty high gain there. And Sacramento, 34%, and a gain there. And then, of course, the state. Now, this number is going to be a little different here. It's 58.4, not 58.7, because now I've switched over to our data. You have to use apples-to-apples data. So our number is a little bit lower. And we are missing one county, one very small county in these state numbers, which is Yuba. But don't tell Yuba I said this, but they're small numbers, so it wouldn't change the percentages at this point. We will be putting out a report on all of these data sometime in the next week and a half. And we're waiting till we have every county represented before we actually put out that report. So Yuba will get its due credit. So what about group turnout? So I'm going to ask you all a question. Keep you awake because the food's kicking in, right? And all those people in the back. What do you think, given whatever your expectations were, but you heard a lot of speculation, right? What do you think the Latino eligible turnout rate was? Again, percentage of Latinos eligible to vote, adult citizens, who actually voted in 2016. You know the statewide number. You got a little help there. What do you think the Latino turnout rate was? This was a big number. This was a big number, right? People wanted to know, still want to know. Yeah. Shoot it out. Just spit it out. 70. Okay. Anybody else? This is eligible voter turnout. The state average. 50. Okay, I didn't want to make you feel bad. State average is 50. I thought if I just say it, state average was a little over 58%. Huh? What was the number over here? 50? I got a 50 and a 50. Anybody else? 43. Now, this is serious business, right? But I got to keep you awake. And I want you to think for a moment. What, again, expectations? You're actually thinking this through, right? What would I expect if I hadn't thought about it? 58. Anyone else? Spit it out. 40. Last one. 60. Okay. Because some folks might expect that Latinos maybe could be higher. That could be an expectation, right? Because of all the energy, all the motivation, because of the Donald Trump factor, potentially, right? We know a lot of, not all, but a lot of mobilization was around, or at least to use Trump in the framing, right, of efforts. So maybe some people might be thinking it could be higher. Ready? 46.3. Now, again, this is serious business. So 58.4, that's what we're comparing apples to apples. 58.4 to 46.3. What's the gap there? 12 percentage points. I'm sorry to say for anybody that might have thought, well, maybe it would have been higher than the state average because of all the energy and attention and motivation. It would have, I never say never as a researcher because that'll be the year that something crazy happens. But the disparities are so entrenched. The gaps in turnout, the differences by race and ethnicity particularly, are so entrenched in California, really any district, right, but California and the U.S., that we would not expect it to be higher. But what we would expect, a good year is to close the gap. A good year, right, a year to make enough, to shake things up and to surprise people would be, okay, it was a good year for everyone, right? We had a second highest eligible turnout in 30 years. Latinos should hopefully, or whatever group you're looking at, we're talking about Latinos right now, hopefully would have done just as well, comparatively speaking, not lost ground. But then a good year, right, or a great year would be closing that gap. Make sense? Okay, so let's talk about, did we close the gap a little bit, right? Did California do that? Well, first, let me take you back a little bit. Now, again, these are just, we don't have data, comparable data over time before 2010 using these data sources. So I have to just stop at 2010. I'll show you registered in a moment. And we'd want to compare midterm to midterm, presidential to presidential, because numbers, remember, are lower for everybody in midterms, although usually the disparities are greater in midterms. But what you'll just see here, just for my point here, is first off, disparities are present, period, right? Same colors as before. Blue is total. Purple is non-Latino, non-Asian. Red is Latino. And Asian American is green. Disparities, again, are entrenched. The question is, did we narrow disparities or widen them? In midterm elections, generally speaking, you widen the disparities. In 2014, everybody voted low. It was a record low turnout rate of 31%. But if you do the math and do a comparison, groups of color did comparably much worse and were more underrepresented. In a presidential year, usually underrepresented groups participate a little bit more, and you narrow the gap. And so we always know that the gap's going to be narrowed over midterm years in a presidential year. But for presidential years, was it a good year? Did we narrow the gap? Make sense? Okay. So and let me just show you here, Asian American eligible voter turnout is 37.8%. Right, so even lower, quite considerable. And if you look at 58 to 37, right, 20 percentage points difference. If you look at non-Latino, non-Asian, which is the eligible turnout rate there is 68%, you're talking 30 percentage points difference here, right? And 22 or so, something like that. Make sense? Okay. So I always emphasize looking at eligible voter turnout rates. Lots of reasons. The main reason, or a main reason, important reason, is that you have disparities in registration rates, like I just showed you already, right? So if you use registered voter turnout, if you're comparing across groups, you don't have an apples to apples denominator, right? You've got groups with different registration rates, so different pies in terms of their registered voter population. So really, if you're looking at it depends on what you're trying to do the analysis of, but if you're looking and interested in capacity and voice and representation, you should be looking at eligible voter turnout. But for those of you that might wonder, and I do have one interesting thing here to show you real quick. So again, same colors, but I didn't put non-Latino, non-Asian here. Again, disparities entrenched, right? But one thing you might notice, what happens here, look at the red, with registered voter turnout, so rates for Asian Americans are always lower than Latinos when it comes to registration rates, right? But registered voter turnout of the pie that is registered, Asian Americans have typically had higher registered voter turnout rates, right? But another example of why you really need to look at eligible. Because they're higher here, but they've got lower registration percentages. Make sense? Okay, hopefully. But look here, so Latinos in terms of registered voter turnout, Latinos lower than Asian American. What happens there? That's very interesting, and so that's for another discussion, but I wanted to show you all that. Okay, back to this chart. We started late too, so I'm going to try to breeze through some of this, but this is the same chart, same legend I showed you a moment ago. Let's look at Latino eligible turnout across the state, right? Differences by county. Much lighter. So we know to expect that because remember 58 to 46 when we talk about the state averages for those groups. But it's still a story across the board, right? But we've got some interesting things happening here. But across the board, right, low turnout. And again, Asian American, Central Valley. And then Asian American, this is also pretty typical. I often will describe this as a patchwork quilt when we look at Asian American turnout by county. Part of the reason here is that in some of these counties have very, very small Asian American populations up in the foothills, the North State. So small changes in turning out to vote can be big changes in your percentages. Make sense? So whenever you're looking, if you're trying to do a geographic analysis or comparison amongst the Asian American vote, you have to do it very carefully. It's a very nuanced conversation. Okay, but I just wanted to show it to you. So calling out some specific counties here just really briefly. The first three happen to be San Francisco, Alpine, and Alameda for Latinos. So the highest turnout rate by county was in San Francisco, 54.3%. That might be of interest to some people. Right, again, an increase over time. We didn't have Alpine for 2012. Alameda, 52%. Los Angeles, 50%, ranked 4th. Something happened in LA. So in 2012, comparable presidential election, for Latino turnout by county, LA was about 13th in rank. This election, 4th. LA had a big change over time, bigger than other groups, so 8.6%. LA helped drive the turnout rate for Latinos in California, right? And often that doesn't happen. So folks that are doing mobilization and doing all kinds of efforts in LA will want to look at these numbers even deeper. But first blush here, it looks quite positive in terms of an effect. Sacramento usually are in about the middle, 44%. Okay. Asian American, again, remember the changes over time because of small population pies. So Siskiyou ranked first, but 16.9 percentage point change. So let's just go down a little bit further and look at some main counties here. San Francisco ranked 30th for Asian American turnout, LA 35th, and Sacramento 40th. And then also a big change for Asian American turnout in LA, 10 percentage points. So for both groups. And then just really quickly, because of time, but this is just by region. I purposely don't put any numbers on here. I just want you to kind of look at the story. Right, overall, but for all groups, San Joaquin Valley has some of the lowest turnout rates, right, just what we talked about before. Great disparities. Some regions, disparities are a little bit less, and some of the stories are a little bit different, right, Latino being less than Asian American, right, and so forth. Okay. By party, really briefly, in any given election, typically Republicans turn out, whether it's high or low turnout, a few percentage points more than Democrats. Just the state happens to have many more Democrats, right? So that's what we would expect here. No party preference. This also is pretty common. We've been tracking it at the CCEP, and it's the California Civic Engagement Project, right, that I direct. We've been tracking no party preference for quite a while, and now it's about 24% of the state registration rolls, somebody who's affiliated as no party preference. Now, we don't know how people voted. This is people who voted that were registered in these ways, right? Again, much lower turnout from MPP, and as MPP is a large percentage of our voter rolls now, that also impacts the bottom line, right, the total number. And this is registered turnout that I'm giving you, of course, because we're talking about party. And then other parties, 65.3%. So this here remains an issue in terms of disparities, right, and disparate impact. Those that are no party preference are not participating as much in the electorate. And there, of course, are self-selection things and all kinds of things to consider about why that is, but just in and of itself, that number should be understood and tracked. Okay. And then just by age, one thing I wanted to show you briefly here, oopsie. So we know Democrats turn out a little bit less than Republicans, right? But when we talk about less than 45, blue is Dem, red is Republican. We'll just focus on that. Look at the young folks. Democrats turn out more than Republicans. We also see this for Latino Republicans and Latino Democrats. Latino Democrats tend to turn out more than Latino Republicans. Huh? I'll let you speculate as to why that is. Okay, so consequences. There are great consequences to disparities in turnout. There are consequences, yes, in terms of just if people aren't voting, they don't have their voice in the system. And I don't have numbers here for African Americans, but we know in California when we get our current population survey data, we'll be able to do a full analysis by race and age and ethnicity. The numbers will be different. They won't be comparable because current population survey data, the different methodology. But I should know African Americans also are underrepresented in California. Not as much numerically as Asians and Latinos, Asian Americans and Latinos, but they are underrepresented. And when you compare at least the last couple of presidential cycles, 2008 and 2012, African Americans nationally were actually almost on par, depending on the measure you used, nationally with whites, actually in 2012 by the CPS data, outperforming whites by 2 percentage points or so. But in California, African Americans still had a little bit lower turnout rates than whites in our state. Okay? Okay. So that story gets lost a lot, but the difference between California and the U.S. And then just to emphasize here, underrepresentation. Did I skip a slide? I didn't. Okay. Oh, sorry. That should say Latinos. I confused myself. So Latinos ended up being, drumbeat, 22.6% of all voters in 2016. Now, when we're talking about disparities in voting, it matters because of people's voice, right? Not participating. But by group, it also matters because disparities in turnout then translate into what I mentioned at the outset about having an electorate that's not representative of the state. Disparities in turnout mean that those groups that have lower turnout rates are going to have a lower share of the pie of voters and are going to be underrepresented numerically. If everybody had the same turnout rates, and actually it doesn't matter whether they're high or low, we want everybody to be high, but if everybody had the same turnout rates, then everybody would be about represented in the pie of voters compared to their population, okay? And I'm going to show you this in a moment on a visual track, but 22.6 But Latinos are 28% of the eligible voter population, so there's a disparity. And then, of course, nearly 40% as being the plurality of the state's population now, if you didn't know. Let's look over time, though. So this little blue bar is the Latino percent of the total population, right? In 2016, there's that 39% I just told you about. Latino percent of CVAP, that's the eligible voter population, adult citizens, right? Over time, steady, changing, and growing. And then the percent of voters. Now, first you see a zigzag because you're talking about midterm to presidential, and so on. Remember, disparities narrow a little bit in presidential years. So this shows you here, when disparities narrow, representation goes up. What the heck happened here? Remember, record low turnout rate for everybody, but Latinos comparatively did even worse. Disparities widened so much that actually lost ground, because before it had been steady increases by type of election. But in 2016, we saw a pretty good jump. And this jump actually outpaced the growth in population. So because Latinos are such a large group in California, right, and growing steadily, we know that there's always that unless you have a huge disparate impact like in 2014, you're going to see a growth in the voter population if turnout rates stay about the same, because you have a larger, right, around the same turnout rate, you have a larger pie, you're going to get higher percent of the vote. Make sense? And we actually did some numbers, did some projections, and this is in some of my other reports, and if you're interested in it, I can direct you. But we said, just trying to isolate the impact of population growth for Latinos, if turnout rate stayed about the same, given projected population growth, what would we expect the turnout rates would be in 2016? And we said about 21%. So outpacing population growth, actually narrowing the gap in representation. Now, 22%, 22.6%, over 21% might not sound like a lot, but in our world, that is a lot. And that definitely is progress. And this, of course, is the highest number we've ever seen. I cannot say officially it's a record because there are not official records for the percent of the vote in California that is Latino. But this is the highest, of course, that we've ever seen, as the population itself is the highest that we've seen in modern time. Make sense? So the biggest share, right? Okay. And then 2012 was 19%. So 19 to 22.3. Okay. And then I just told you about this. And for Asian Americans, now that title is correct, 8.1% of the 2016 vote compared to 12.4% of the eligible voter population compared to 13% of the total. So also very much underrepresented. Latinos made up a little bit more ground than Asian Americans did. So the youth vote, really quickly. I have to answer that question. And I'm just going to show you. 36.1%. Does anybody remember, from if you've gone to my previous talks, what the 2014 eligible turnout rate for young people were, age 18 to 24? That's how we define it. You remember that number is a pretty dramatic number in 2014. 2014 youth turnout rate. It was 8.2%. Exactly. We released that report. I went all over the state and even out of the state. I'd asked everybody the question, flash it up. I made it a really big number, dramatic pause and everything, to really make a point. Every time I presented that number all over the place, I had audible gasps. You didn't have there would have been more gasps right now if you'd seen it. But this is not a midterm election. It's not a record low turnout midterm election. We of course knew we wouldn't see anything near 8%. So yes, get excited about that change, but it's not a comparable change, right, to that midterm election, if that makes sense. But at 36.1%, how does that compare? So let me show you just over time by age. Here's that 58.4%, right, for everybody. Break out the electorate in 2016. This is, again, eligible voter turnout. There's 36.1%. Then boom, just by 25 to 34, you shoot up. And look at the group. It's always the 65 to 74-year-olds that have the highest turnout rates, which is great. We want everybody to be up, right, at those numbers. 74.3%. And then still pretty steady high for the next group. So one of the reasons why we're an older electorate, right, is these disparities, big reason, is these disparities in turnout. Okay. And then really quickly, this is something we'll go into depth in the report, but we did break it out by race and age. So the Latino vote, for instance, right, over time, read by age, or sorry, not over time, by over the ages. and Asian Americans. But I'm going to skip that because of time. And then just to emphasize the underrepresentation of youth. So that 36% eligible turnout rate, right, that I just showed you in this election that just passed, what does it mean for their representation? Well, they were 8.7% of all actual voters, but they're 14% of the eligible voter population. They are declining, though. Like in 2014, they were 14.5% of the eligible voter population. They are declining, the young people, age 18 to 24, across the board, not taking, regardless of race or ethnicity, as a group, are declining in proportions and in actual numbers. So literally, the number of 18 to 24-year-olds that are eligible to vote in California declined in the last couple of years. And that'll be continuing for several more years. So we're an aging society, and we actually are losing numbers. So given that, so again, underrepresentation, and then older people, right? Older folks, older age groups, overrepresented. 19% of voters versus 17% of eligible, right? See that? Okay. Now, over time, this chart just shows you the percent of the vote in each election that is age 18 to 24. There's that 8.7% that I just mentioned to you, right? Much better than 2014, because 8% eligible voter turnout made only 3.9% of voters. Better than 2012, right? Not as good as 2008. Young people did get to close the gap a lot more in 2008. But higher than 2004, and considering, again, declining population and population proportions, this actually overall I think is pretty good. Okay, so turnout summary. This is your takeaway points, some of your takeaway points. So you know, second highest eligible turnout rate in 30 years for everyone as a whole. Highest at 22.6%, highest Latino share of total voters. I didn't say record because, again, records haven't been, so I'm a researcher, I can't do it. I can't say it's a record. But it's the highest that we've seen, right? And that's exciting. Asian Americans increased turnout, but not as high as Latinos, so gaining ground, but not as much. And youth increased despite their population declines, as I mentioned. And bottom line, we saw an increased turnout, at least over 2012, for sure. We saw a little bit narrowing of the gap, but there are still significant disparities that remain. So all those groups, they did so much mobilization, so exciting. It did pay off. There was progress. But disparities, the work still remains, right? Very much so. We have a lot of work and a lot of challenge ahead of us to get a representative electorate. Okay. And then, I'm going to skip through here. You know all of these. We talked about some of this. But just factors for turnout. Again, it's a presidential. It's going to be higher over 2014. We know that. 17 ballot initiatives. I'm not quite sold. There's a debate in the field in terms of whether initiatives themselves actually increase turnout. But we do know it has they bring a lot of, and they did bring a lot more money and effort and phone calls that remind people there's an election and you can have an impact there. We had an open Senate race, and then, of course, the Trump effect. And maybe we'll talk about that later. And then always present voter apathy, but I say not really apathy, that most of what we think of as apathy is really people feeling disconnected from the political process, which I think has been growing by survey data, certainly over the recent years. And this election that just passed, I think, has only served, probably, we'll find that people are even more disconnected from the process, right, with all that went on. Just leading up to not even talking about the results, but the tone and the tenor and the rhetoric and all of that. Institutional barriers remain, barriers like registration, right? The numbers don't lie in terms of those disparities. There's a lack of full mobilization across the state, and underrepresented groups, well documented, get much less turnout and mobilization and phone calls, even when they're registered, than other groups. And that is a factor in turnout. And then demographic change overall is our number, and I didn't mention it at the outset, but California typically falls in the bottom 20% of all states. We did in 2014. This time we were in the bottom quarter. We're about 25th percent, if that makes sense. But one of our challenges is that we have such a large population of voters that typically vote much lower, that are underrepresented. And as that continues to increase, as we become more of color, if we don't support those groups in voting and bring up those voter turnout numbers, it impacts our overall turnout rates, right? Another reason why it matters for everyone in terms of our representation as a state. So where do we go from here? Just a few things that I'll leave you with. I always say that I think if we're interested in increasing turnout, that first off, when you talk about turnout, you should be talking about turnout and representation together. Like that, those two should just be married, those two phrases. Why? Because when you're talking about initiatives, whether on-the-ground mobilization or electoral reforms, and California has engaged in a lot of electoral reforms that put us in, out front. We're trying to expand access, right, as opposed to decrease in some states. And that's been fantastic. But whatever type of reforms or initiatives you're thinking about, you should be asking the question, is this going to increase turnout and representation? Because you can find yourself maybe in a situation where you've created a reform or initiative that might increase turnout, but maybe it doesn't increase turnout for everybody, or maybe it doesn't do it at the same rates, and maybe even inadvertently could widen the gap in turnout. If you marry these together, right, then you ask the questions and you develop initiatives that will, hopefully, be more likely to get us to a representative electorate. And just some things to point out, this is not an exclusive or inclusive note here, but we have lots of exciting things happening in 2016. Automatic or automated voter registration coming later this year through the DMV. 16-year-old pre-registration available now. Same-day voter registration, which is a little bit more, it's a conditional voter registration, which I could talk about, but it is now active, although we don't have an election right now. But vote centers will be coming to those counties that opt in to vote centers. If you haven't heard, you can look that up if you're interested. And then outreach and education. And here I don't mean about voter turnout, but I mean outreach and education on the electoral reforms. Because we're only as good as people know about them, are accurately informed about them, and want to use them and can use them correctly, right? So important as we have so many new reforms come in that we do that properly and fully and reach everyone. So again, we increase representation and we don't lose anyone. And then making people want to vote. This is the disconnection issue. And maybe if we have a few minutes here at the end, I'll ask if anybody wants to talk more about that. But that's, again, people needing to feel like there's an impact, a reason to vote, that their elected representatives matter to them and their communities and will actually make a change. And people struggle with that. And we certainly don't have a culture of voting. Not with 58%, right? Here, my point with civic engagement and voting connection is really that these are intimately interconnected, or they should be. There's so many good efforts across the state around civic engagement, but they never talk about voting, or they just talk about it in a cursory way, go register. But it's not what they're funded for. They may even feel that they're not supposed to talk about explicitly voting and registration, and some things they are limited. But I argue that for those that are doing civic engagement, you should be talking about voting as a key part or piece of the puzzle for whatever issues you care about. You want change on issues? Let's talk about all these things that we can do plus voting. And for all the voting efforts that are out there, should be talking also about the other kinds of things people are doing or want to do to bring about change and keep them connected all through our cycle, right? And not just connect with people right before the election. So many wonderful efforts around registration and voting. When do they gear up? Right before the election. We need to move beyond the election cycle. The fact is, the difference between a high turnout year and a low turnout year is just a few percentage points. I will be back here again in a few years, very excited about a few changes, but if we really want to move the needle, we need to move beyond the election cycle, particularly now, as I've been saying, people are feeling the election in their gut. Whether they're happy about it or fearful about what happened, either way, it's in your gut, right? You're surprised, you're shocked, you're excited, you're fearful, you're dismayed, you're depressed, whatever it might be, or somewhere, but people are feeling it. We're going to wait a year or year and a half to talk to them again about voting. And lastly, I've talked a lot about civics, but bringing civics, we have a Power of Democracy initiative here in California. There's a lot of momentum around that. Sacramento is one of the counties that are part of their pilot program. But as we talk about bringing civics back and reprioritizing in our schools, we should, of course, also be talking about norms of civic dialogue, civil dialogue, debate, tolerance, media literacy. That's probably a no-brainer to many people, but I got to put it up there. And that's it. Okay, so we have just a few minutes. We started a little late, but I'm happy to stick around. Is any burning questions? Yeah. And are you talking, because we're researchers, so we don't actually conduct. engagement efforts. Okay. I haven't connected with them, but I'd love to learn more. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah. Yeah. Well, in terms of data, it's very difficult. We don't have data that would tell us definitively what that would bring. I think it's an interesting idea. I think it actually connects to the culture of voting, which I just talked about really briefly. In and of itself, that wouldn't, I would be surprised if it changed the numbers significantly. It might change some of the numbers. But you have to, many of the countries that have some of these ideas like mandatory voting